Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the previous episode, I discussed the many and very substantial problems that the United States faced after the Revolutionary War had ended. I talked about the debt that it was in, the disorder that pervaded, the foreign threats that the United States was under, and the fact that the Articles of Confederation government really was not very well equipped to help the United States deal with all of those problems. In this episode, I'm going to discuss how it was that leaders of the various states and of the Confederation Congress decided finally, after attempting to make things work with the government under the Articles of Confederation, that changes needed to be made. Reform was required. I'm going to talk about the initial agenda and structure of the Constitutional Convention that met in the spring and summer of 1787. But before I get into all that, I'd like to remind you all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Again, it helps other people find the show, and the more people find the show and watch and listen, the more I can do this. And I'm really enjoying it so far, and I hope you all are as well. So please like and subscribe. Tell your family, tell your friends. Thank you very much. As always, I'm going to start the show by giving you all a question to think about as I go through this information. And I'm going to remind you of the resources that I am using to put together the outline for the show. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the resources. They are the same as the last episode. They changed a little bit in that episode from the previous few that I'd done. It is, first of all, the American Pageant, which I've used throughout the whole series so far. It's an AP US History textbook. So is Give Me Liberty, also an AP US History textbook. There is The Glorious Cause, The American Revolution, 1763 to 1789 by Robert Middlecoff, and that's part of the Oxford History of the United States series. Then the two newer resources that I use starting with the last episode are those that cover specifically the formation, the creation, the structure, the arguments, all of the stuff that went into the United States Constitution. The first of those is called Plain Honest Men, The Making of the American Constitution, and that was written by Richard Beeman. And then the other book, which is a little bit older, it's from the 1960s. It's called Miracle at Philadelphia, The Story of the Constitutional Convention, May to September 1787, and that was written by Catherine Drinker Bowen. The question that I want you all to focus on, or that you can focus on, it's up to you whether or not you want to think about it, but I think that contemplating this question as you're listening to the things that I'm saying will help you to make more sense of those things and to probably remember them a little bit better and just engage in a good critical thinking exercise. So I think it's worthwhile. So the question is this: what specific failures of the government under the Articles of Confederation brought the Constitutional Convention into being in 1787? And are these failures the primary reason for the young United States struggles in the 1780s? I'll say that one more time. What specific features of the government under the Articles of Confederation brought the Constitutional Convention into being in 1787? And are these failures the primary reason for the young United States struggles in the 1780s? So that gives you, I think, also some foreshadowing about where this episode is going to go specifically. Let's go ahead and jump in. As I said, I described in the previous episode all these problems that the United States is facing. It is foreign threats. It is debt. It is states fighting with each other. It is a government that is wrangling cats and is just not even nearly equipped to do the job of wrangling cats, which is quite difficult. All of these problems build upon one another. Now, there's some historians I've read who say that as the Constitutional Convention was meeting, things were actually looking up in some ways, that the economy, which had been in really bad shape, in part because of the regulatory issues and the issues about interstate trade that became very difficult to resolve and because of the debt and some other things, that those were on their way to getting better even without the Constitutional Convention meeting and coming up with the Constitution. But even those historians, most of them, some kind of intimate or suggest that perhaps things might have gotten better absent a new Constitution. But most of them seem to say, yeah, okay, things were maybe getting better, but who knows how long that would have lasted if the Articles had remained in place and a stronger central government had not been created. Whatever perspective you want to take on it, if you think that, okay, maybe things would have gotten better, or if you think that there was no way they were going to get better long term, what happened happened. The Constitutional Convention met, and we ended up with a much stronger, much different central government than that created by the Articles. And here's kind of what's going on. Faith in the Confederation Congress was very weak as the war was prosecuted, and that is maybe best explained by looking at the struggles of the Continental Army and George Washington's constant complaints about how his troops were not supplied or even given food or clothing in an adequate way. But it wasn't just that. It was also states that were not getting a lot out of the existence of the Confederation Congress and were at the same time suspicious of how much power it was going to have. So the situation between the states and the Confederation Congress in terms of their faith in one another wasn't awesome from the get-go. By the 1780s, by the time the war was over, states had already gravitated toward going their own way on trade, on their economic interests apart from trade, defense, and other things, governance in general. They had all, not all, but many of the states and many of the leaders in those states and many of the just average citizens in those states had come to the conclusion that this government wouldn't work, or the whole notion of a United States of America wouldn't work, or some combination of those things. And given all the dysfunction and all the challenges faced by the United States, you can kind of understand how they came to that conclusion, the people who did. So states had kind of already started to migrate their own way and start doing things as they wanted to do them. It got so bad, the lack of guidance to the states by the Confederation Congress and the infighting among all of the states, that some states were damn near at war with each other by the time you get to 1784, 85, 86. Things were very difficult, and there are a number of issues you can point to that demonstrate the very serious problems that these states were trying to resolve on their own. By way of example, Virginia and Maryland were fighting over who got what kinds of navigation rights to the Potomac and to the Chesapeake Bay, which they share, right? The Potomac River, for those of you that are not aware, not East Coasters, not from that part of the country, is essentially the border in a lot of areas between Maryland and Virginia. And it flows into the Chesapeake Bay. Those two bodies of water are the economic lifeblood in a lot of cases for these two states that make a lot of their money on exporting goods, agricultural goods for the most part, tobacco, foodstuffs, out of the country and to like British colonies or to Europe or to wherever. So if you're Virginia, and Maryland essentially claimed that it had the sole right to control the Potomac River. And it was, the state of Maryland was being pretty possessive and obstinate about how much the state was going to be allowed to control the Potomac. Virginia was kind of like, hey, what the fuck, man? I mean, like, you know, we need to use this thing too. It's a body of water. How can you possibly have total control of it when it's running across a lot of our land area, right? Kind of makes sense. Well, that was an issue, and there was not any kind of national government to step in and resolve it. Like, it's just the two of them trying to sort it out. The Confederation Congress can barely function. It's certainly not in a position to mediate a major dispute like that between two of the biggest, most populous, most influential states in the United States at that time. There's other issues like that. New York was trying to put tariffs on any goods that would come into or out of New Jersey. And New Jersey doesn't, at least did not at the time, have a functional port that it could use to get goods in and out of the state. Everything more or less went through New York City. So having to pay a tariff and other associated costs and having New York totally control the one artery through which everything would flow was a real problem for people in New Jersey. Another example of an issue is territorial disputes. I mentioned in the last episode that one of the only things that got all of the states on board with the Articles of Confederation in the first place was that Virginia finally gave up this massive claim that it had had to land in the Ohio River Valley. Well, that wasn't the only land dispute among the states. There was also a dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania about what is currently northeastern Pennsylvania and which of the two of them would have control of that area. And again, there's no mediator. Nobody's going to step in and be like, hey, okay, show me your evidence. Show me your evidence. Connecticut, okay, here's what it looks like for you. Pennsylvania, here's what it looks like for you. Here's what we're going to do. It was just the two of them left to sort it out, and neither of them really wants to give an inch in most of these cases. So it's unresolved, and it gets ugly, and it creates a lot more problems. And one thing the young United States certainly did not need was more problems to resolve. These kinds of issues are a big part of the reason why the Founding Fathers, leaders of many states, looked at this situation and said, this is untenable. We can't go on like this. Something's got to change. Apart from the disputes among states, Congress, the Confederation Congress, had basically given up trying to dictate how the states would contribute funds to the national government. So at a very minimum, the national government could pay for defending the country from the various threats that faced it: the French, the Spanish, the Native Americans, the British, who had not left their forts on the western frontiers, and in addition to other things. And the government couldn't get money together to pay off the national debt, which made it difficult to borrow more money or to engage in any kind of international trade with other countries. The Confederation Congress and the government, the national government of the Articles, became so desperate that they were finally, just by 1787, like, fine, pay however the hell you want to. Just pay us something. And so what did a lot of these states then do? They started printing their own money. Because that is the solution oftentimes for a lot of young states, is that they just start to print money and worry about the details later. And that's kind of what a lot of these states started to do. You know, engaging in currency finance, as it's called, was the solution to their money problems, and it didn't really resolve much of anything for the national debt. So into this situation with all these problem steps, one of the most prominent founding fathers, one of the most important figures in terms of putting together the Constitution and shaping the national government, a guy that, you know, is not as famous as like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, but is pretty important. His name is Robert Morris, and he was from Pennsylvania. He was a one-time superintendent of finance. That was his official title during the Revolutionary War, and a very wealthy merchant, which is part of why he was tapped as the superintendent of finance, was that he had been very successful as a merchant, shown that he could manage money and make money. So they figured in the Continental Congress, hey, let's put this guy in charge. You know, he seems like he knows what he's doing. And he, like other nationalists, and in this context, what I mean by nationalist is someone who wants a stronger national government and sees the states as all part of one thing and not as 13 separate islands. Wants a nation of these states to be genuinely united under one government in a way that was not really the case under the Articles of Confederation. And in addition to Robert Morris, it's guys like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Jay. Those are examples of figures who, in the 1780s, looked at the situation with the Articles of Confederation government and said, this is not going to work. We got to fix this. Some of them were more vocal than others, but they all kind of agreed that this wasn't going to work. We need something better and stronger than what we have right now. Robert Morris, along with certainly Alexander Hamilton and a few of the other founding fathers that would call themselves nationalists, thought that public finance and the ability to tax would provide the best basis for constitutional reform. Morris and others saw that as the key, the ability of the national government to take in revenue and to spend the revenue in a way that benefited the entire country, or most of it anyway. That was the way to bring everybody together in their view. When Robert Morris and his cohorts failed at various places at various times to try to create a stronger national government or try to solve the financial problems of the United States under the Articles of Confederation government. I did mention in the previous episode that Morris and Hamilton kind of pushed the Newburgh conspirators up in New York, who Washington had to go up and calm down, and Hamilton in particular communicated to Washington about what was going on and kind of pushed him to join in on the conspiracy, because Hamilton and others thought that that was the only way that they were going to get a stronger central government, is if there was some kind of clear and present danger to the United States, like a potential coup. Morris supported that effort, the Newburgh conspiracy, because he thought it would result in a stronger national government. He also tried, along with Hamilton and several others, to institute an impost, which is really just a sort of general term for a tax that all the states would pay. And they tried at various times to get all the states on board, and most of them eventually did get on board, but New York put these really onerous conditions on the impost that made it such a pain in the ass that it wasn't going to be approved. Most leaders in Pennsylvania anyway wanted to do the same thing. They followed suit, and so the impost never came to anything, and the government of the Articles could not really collect any real tax money. So when these ideas, when these measures or attempts at pushing the country in the direction of a stronger central government failed, Hamilton, Morris, Jay, some of the others turned to this notion of a convention, like the Continental Congress, that would get together and grant Congress the ability, at a minimum, to regulate commerce, if not to tax. You start to see some really vocal, they wrote to each other, right? They didn't have like radio or the internet back then, obviously, so they couldn't communicate with each other literally vocally, but they really pushed hard in letters, and at times when they met with each other publicly, some of these guys did anyway, to get a convention together that would strengthen the authority of the government under the Articles of Confederation. James Madison, and this is where he emerges as a very important figure, is in the 1780s. He was quite a bit younger than a lot of these guys, but he is, if you're going to pick one individual of the Founding Fathers, perhaps the guy most responsible for the Constitution as it was written. James Madison might be the one guy that you would pick as being most responsible for the Constitution being what it is. Madison was from Virginia, and he gets Virginia's House of Delegates, as that legislature, now that it's an independent state, comes to be called. It's not the House of Burgesses anymore, it's the House of Delegates. He gets the House of Delegates to call for a convention of states to, and this is a quotation here, to consider a uniform system in their commercial regulations in January of 1786. So this is about a year and a half before the Constitutional Convention actually meets. Invitations and a meeting went out after Madison gets the House of Delegates to do this, and delegates from New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia, so it's only 5 of the states, meet on September 11th, 1786, in Annapolis, which is in Maryland. It's now the capital. Maryland actually didn't send any representatives, as it turned out, mostly because they're afraid, at least some of the leaders in Maryland, some of the state leaders, are afraid of further weakening the Confederation Congress. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, North Carolina sent delegates, but they all arrived after the convention had ended. So they didn't end up really having any input. And ultimately, because you had representatives from 5 states, less than half, substantially less than half, of the original 13, not a whole lot got done. It wasn't productive in the way that guys like Madison and Jay and Hamilton, Morris, were hoping that it would be. The only real concrete achievement of the Annapolis Convention was to set another meeting for May of 1787, which became the Constitutional Convention. In the meantime, between the Annapolis Convention and the meeting of the Constitutional Convention, Shays' Rebellion happened, which I mentioned in the previous episodes, this uprising of Western Massachusetts farmers, many of them, were Revolutionary War veterans, pissed off about the economy and the fact they're losing their farms. They kind of just take the court that is issuing the foreclosure notices by force, and they just institute vigilante law, essentially. That is scary to a lot of the upper classes in all of the states, not just in Massachusetts. The combination of Shays' Rebellion and the influence of the delegates who did attend the Annapolis Convention and others who sympathized with those that went and wanted much the same thing that they wanted, that combines to get the Confederation Congress to call for a convention on February 21st, 1787. So this is the Articles of Confederation government, the central government under the Articles of Confederation saying, yes, let's have a convention in February of 1787. So once the Confederation Congress gave its stamp of approval for a convention to meet with the aim of reforming the Articles of Confederation, fixing the things that really needed to be fixed, they were off and running. However, even a lot of the ambitious, the people who desperately wanted to make big changes to the way the national government worked, didn't know when they set out on this process what would ultimately occur. Some of them had notions that they would be scrapping the Articles government altogether and starting over afresh. But the vast majority of them had no idea that this was the path they were going down in the spring of 1787. Altogether, 55 guys participated in the Constitutional Convention. They were from 12 states. Rhode Island was the only state that didn't send anybody to the convention, mostly because Rhode Island was fiercely independent, did not want a stronger central government really in any fashion, and was suspicious of the process. And it wasn't just people in Rhode Island, as we will see, but Rhode Island had probably the most profound level of suspicion when it came to the people in charge of that state. So they didn't end up sending anybody at all. But 55 dudes went all together. They were in and out. I'll get into the details of who it was and when they were there and all that kind of thing. They went there with the intention, for the most part, of amending the Articles of Confederation to make it functional. That's what most of them thought they were headed to do. I want to read to you a resolution from the Articles of Confederation government, the Confederation Congress, that spells out more or less what the Confederation Congress thinks it has agreed to, because it's revealing. I think it's a good thing to know in order to understand how much the process shifted along the way. And I think it's important to know what the Confederation Congress was thinking and to compare what it approved with what actually happened so that you can understand just how surprised and in some cases chagrined and shocked and disturbed by what came out of the convention when it became public in the fall of 1787. So here's the official language of the Confederation Congress resolution. Resolved that in the opinion of Congress, it is expedient that on the second Monday in May next, a convention of delegates who shall have been appointed by the several states be held at Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revisiting the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. So TLDR, or the short version of that, you guys can all get together and fix this thing because it's fucked up. But we're watching you. and we reserve the right to actually approve what you've decided to do. That's, I think, the short version of what this is saying. And there's a reason for, you can sense the suspicion in that statement, I think. You don't have to just sense it there, because there were people who out and out voiced their suspicion and were genuinely anxious and worried about what these guys were going to do in Philadelphia when they all met together. There's some really famous examples of very deeply distrustful people. Patrick Henry, he of the "give me liberty or give me death" statement leading up to the Revolutionary War, famously said he, quote, "smelt a rat." He did not participate in the Constitutional Convention because he thought that things were afoot that he and other leaders of states and those concerned about a more powerful central government would not approve of. Turned out he was very right. Along with Patrick Henry, Sam Adams was another guy who didn't like where he thought this might go and was worried that individual rights and states' rights would be put at risk by making the national government much more powerful. James Madison, who was gung-ho about this and did a lot to try to bring others on board with him, and the Virginia delegation, and that includes George Washington, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, John Blair, James McClurg, and George Wythe, met together alone when they arrived in Pennsylvania starting on May 15th. Madison got there even earlier than that and advised his colleagues to do the same, but they got there a lot later than he did. So these 7 guys from Virginia, who were more or less on the same page that there needed to be a much stronger national government, met together in the mornings starting on May 15th and planned out their 15 resolves, which were going to be the basis for their suggestions about reform to the Articles of Confederation. They were joined after a day or two by many, I think most, of the delegates from Pennsylvania. And there were 8 of those altogether: George Clymer, Thomas Fitzsimmons, Benjamin Franklin, Jared Ingersoll, Thomas Mifflin, Governor Morris, Robert Morris, and James Wilson. They met with the Virginia delegates in the afternoons and worked together with them before the full convention met. It took a pretty significant amount of time for a lot of the delegates to get there because, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, the modes of transportation at this time weren't great, and some of these guys were coming from a pretty significant distance away. So a lot of the delegates didn't get there when the convention started. And in fact, by way of example, J.F. Mercer, who was from Maryland, didn't arrive at the convention at all until August 11th. So the convention had been going on for nearly 3 months before one of the delegates, the last one to arrive from any of the states, got there. And though there were 55 delegates, as I mentioned a moment ago, only 32, 33 at the most were ever all together at the same time. And only 11 states were ever represented at the same time. Never all 12. Finally, a quorum is reached. For those of you that don't know, a quorum is a minimum number needed to have a valid vote in any voting, usually legislative body. And quorum is reached on May 25th, and the Virginia plan is then introduced to the full body on May 29th, and that's where this really gets started. And I'm going to get into that in the next episode. So thanks very much, as always, for tuning in, for watching or listening. Again, please like and subscribe. It really does help the channel, and I would certainly appreciate it. You can also reach out to me with any comments or suggestions or questions at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a text or a voicemail at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again, as always, for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Hope you all enjoyed this. And I'll be back next time where I'll get into the fundamentals of the Constitution, what it actually looked like. Looking forward to it. Take care. I'll see you then.